Welcome to the Untangling Web3 podcast. So, Bitcoin was born out of distrust in banks. Web3 promised a new internet owned by users, not platforms. But here we are in 2025. BlackRock holds billions in Bitcoin. PayPal has its own stablecoin, and governments are tokenizing bonds on private blockchains. So, what happened? In this episode, we're asking the big question. Are big institutions saving Web3 or killing the dream it was built on? Big questions, Jack.
Yes, very good questions. I think for a lot of the Bitcoin maxis out there, the last couple of years has been interesting because Bitcoin has never been so popular and never been so mainstream. But at the same time, maybe the way it's going mainstream has challenged some of the things they might hold dear, right, to the original vision of Bitcoin and things like that. So yeah, I think it's been a very interesting couple of years. 2024 is probably the year of the financial institutions and big corporates at large taking Bitcoin to a greater extent, and other cryptos to a lesser extent taking them much more seriously. And 2025 is just seeing that continue. So yeah, I think it's a good time to review what's happened and why.
Yeah, and it's hard to say whether that was always inevitable, whether that had to happen. Like with the shifting of power, obviously the parties in power were going to resist that or try and get a piece of that. It's kind of, in a lot of ways, always going to happen. But let's jump into it. Let's set the tone nice and early. We're saying that institutions have come. So let me shoot out some numbers at you just to justify that institutions are there. Right now, over 2.2 million BTC, that is 10% of the total supply, is now held by institutions, ETFs, and governments. And as we often know, there's only ever going to be a limited amount of Bitcoin made. So 10%, that's 10% of the total supply, is only ever going to go up unless the institutions decide to sell it themselves. So that's an interesting one. We also look at, Bitcoin right now is at an absolute all-time high, and price tends to mean demand. And obviously, there's a lot of demand coming from retailer, but particularly in institutions of that 10% total supply. We've got over 80 public companies now following what is defined as the Bitcoin standard, collectively owning 3.4% of the supply. MicroStrategy alone holds over 500,000 BTC. So these are some huge numbers that really do justify that institutions are already in Bitcoin in the Web3 space.
Yeah, and I think those are big numbers, right? And maybe the kind of numbers you'd expect of an asset that is maturing in its life cycle. The idea of it being on treasuries and balance sheets of large companies would make sense, right, in terms of an asset mix that where they're trying to hedge against inflation, against other market movements from the whole pool of stock shares, commodities that you could have on your balance sheets. So I think that makes a lot of sense. We've obviously also seen with the ETF inflows from the last couple of years, since the Bitcoin spot ETF and Ethereum spot ETFs were approved kind of last year and the year before. That's obviously a kind of a step between, I guess, the consumer and the institutions as well, because the reason that those products are being used, as we discussed previously on the show, is ultimately to give end users exposure to things like Bitcoin through their retirement savings accounts and their pension funds and things like that. So I think it's been, although mostly heavy on the institutions starting to step in, there is also this new mode of getting involved for the end user as well, because previously your only way of getting exposure to Bitcoin was spinning up a Coinbase account, or if you were tech savvy enough, mining it yourself, or acquiring some directly on chain, essentially, which is not so easy to do.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it as well. It's like, obviously the pioneers in this space were technically aware of the characteristics of Bitcoin and the advantages that Bitcoin had. And because they were technically aware, they could get involved on themselves, right? They could get involved by themselves to handle private keys, generate private keys, do the transfers before these super kind of modern UX systems, the wallets that we know, love, and use today were widely adopted. I think another thing that I just want to mention is this trend for institutional adoption and interest is only growing. So if we look at, say, institutional investors, over 83% of them have a plan to increase their crypto allocations in 2025. 41% already hold spot crypto, and 96% believe in the long-term value proposition of Bitcoin and crypto. So institutional adoption is here. It's only going to grow. So that 10% supply is almost certainly going to go up. But how did this all happen? Like, we've given I think one of our was it our second episode actually went into the origin story of Bitcoin. I know Jack absolutely loves this story, but we're not going to go too hard into the entire history. I think just setting some of the scene will be quite useful just to see where it started, what the community looked like then, and how it's kind of evolved over the years to where we are now, which I imagine for a lot of the early adopters would have been quite unpredictable. To think of people like BlackRock and governments coming into the space in 2025, I imagine they wouldn't have thought that possible, or even something they wanted to aim for back when this was invented in 2008.
Yeah, and that is casting our minds back a long time. If you even not to 2008, but to 2 years ago when we first kind of covered the origin story of Bitcoin on the show, that we were very much less grey at the time, I think. But yeah, I think the reason it's important to do that is everything we've just said about institutional adoption is kind of couched in the idea that Bitcoin is being treated as an asset class. Right, I already mentioned that terminology and phrasing before. Whereas back in 2008, asset class wasn't necessarily the pitch of Bitcoin, right? So if you look back to when the original white paper was released, there's all these kind of these theories that get mapped onto how it was created, and more specifically why it was created, because it was launched immediately following the 2008 financial crisis. It had the famous kind of cryptic message, or maybe to some people very much not cryptic
Mhm.
message in the Genesis block about the chancellor bailing out the banks for a second time. So for a lot of people, Bitcoin has always been this kind of anti-bank idea, this financial institution idea. But I think also if you look at the white paper in and of itself, and you don't look at some of that mythology around Bitcoin, it was very much pitching itself clearly as a payment system, right? It was electronic peer-to-peer cash was the original idea, and this is something that had been as we've covered before, people have been trying to come up with electronic money, e-money, digital cash, whatever you want to call it, just an electronic form of a monetary instrument that can be used for the same things we use fiat currency for payments, for store of value, for medium of exchange, etc. So yeah, that for me, I don't know if you have an opinion on this, Alec. Mine has always been that I take the starting point of Bitcoin as this is a new way of doing money for payments. Basically, it's more on the cash system side of it than anything else. Because also there was a lot of thinking around, the internet at this point in 2008 had been around functionally for 10, 15 years, right? And
Mm.
there was never really a native currency for the internet. So I think that was its kind of niche originally, or the proposition was this should be the currency of the internet, right? But I don't know if you have a different take on that.
No, that's it, my take as well. Like when we look at, say, I mean, Satoshi's obviously held up as a semi-deity figure in so many kind of circles, and it was obvious that he was trying to replace the monetary system, but in a digital capacity. And what I mean by that is like mostly around, I imagine, retail users, like retail transfers, high frequency. Like if we're looking at the numbers of Bitcoin now, it doesn't do that. But I think a lot of the commentary of Satoshi early on, he kind of did envision that there would be more transactions and the network should support more transactions. And that's not to say that that should be what Bitcoin is doing, right? Obviously, systems evolve over time. And one of the beauties of having a decentralized system like Bitcoin is that the community decides, and the nodes, the validators, are the ones that vote for upgrades. They vote to go in a certain direction, and you tend to assume that they are representative of the community. But yeah, I agree that it was obviously always intended as an electronic cash system. That was the title of the white paper. Whether that should be the aim, I don't know, but it's certainly not that now. And I think that's one of the interesting things is it's come so far from that. And I kind of want to talk about not only how the tech has changed from that, but also how the community and the culture has changed. So like I say, it was invented, the white paper was released in 2008 early on. Jack mentioned it's around a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Some of the features, permissionless transfers, double spend resistance, decentralized trust, importantly. So it was around this premise of don't trust verify anyone being able to look at a transaction and prove that that transaction is valid. And that doesn't mean that like you can see everything. I know all of Jack's weird and wonderful transactions and what he's buying, but he can prove that to me should he need to. So the sending party and receiving party can both prove that a transaction is valid and that it's on chain. But the early culture of the community was very cypherpunk, right?
It's some new music you've been listening to, I like.
Yeah, cypherpunk. I do love funk music. Was that very cypherpunk? Sorry. So it was around privacy, self sovereignty, a lot of things around cryptographic freedom and censorship resistance. There's a lot of talk in, say, the Web3 community about people being shut off from the monetary systems. And we're going to touch on a little bit about that later, which I think is really interesting to see these same conversations happening in the Web3 and especially amongst crypto communities because of the institutional adoption. But this was really at the heart of the early community of Bitcoin in the early 2010s, right? They were all about self sovereignty, not being dependent on these big intermediaries, and a lot around like personal freedoms and liberties.
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting if it doesn't really matter in my view what you want to ascribe to Satoshi's thinking behind Bitcoin and what it was supposed to be. It's still a fact that the community it was initially released to, right? It was released on the cryptography or cypherpunk kind of mailing list, right? And it's circulated around those communities, so people who are quite, anti-state, anti-banking system, all those kind of high privacy focused individuals looking to find potentially a money that circumvented nation states, circumvented the banking system. That was the early culture of Bitcoin. That's the early culture of people who picked it up. Like, look no further than Silk Road, right? That was one of the very first and earliest use cases and adoptions of Bitcoin, was use on this kind of illegal online marketplace. So if you look at how things have changed over time, actually the technology of Bitcoin has been incredibly stagnant, and that is, potentially one of the strengths of it as a system. It's been battle tested over that. How long is it now? Like 17 years. God, that's making me feel really old. But it's been battle tested over a very long time. It hasn't changed a huge amount. Obviously, there's been big changes in implementation from a kind of philosophical perspective, you could say. But in terms of the bare nuts and bolts of how it works, not a huge amount has changed. It's retained crucially the same proof of work mechanism for securing that consensus and having the double spend prevention and things like that. So that's something it has that is different to, say, an Ethereum, which has changed its consensus mechanism to proof of stake. But it's crucially that community has changed drastically, because no longer is it this small pool of kind of potentially anti-state cypherpunks that are developing and being proponents of Bitcoin. As soon as it has, I say as soon as, maybe not as soon as, it took a very, very long time for it to gain kind of mainstream traction. But now, from like, let's say 2015, 16, 17 onwards, as soon as it started hitting the mainstream the first few times with the big price spikes, it's now been opening up that pool to a much wider set of people who have, I think, pretty much solidified its status as a digital asset and something to use as a store of value. The whole digital gold narrative has kind of taken over from then, and the cypherpunks, whether they like it or not, I mean, some of them love that. But the people who wanted to use it for online payments, for all sorts of things, they are kind of a little bit more stuck now, I think.
Yeah, and I guess they love it because number go up, right? They got in early. They probably were mining a lot of the Bitcoin, and now we're at an all-time high. And I've seen lots of, say, early Bitcoin adopters who are still working to innovate and have maybe moved from Bitcoin itself to, say, more innovative projects, saying that a lot of the early big innovators have left Web3 generally because they made a crap ton of money, and they can just go live on an island now happily and get out of the system. And maybe that's because they saw what was going to happen when the big institutions got in there, and they wouldn't be able to compete anymore. I think another thing we have to think about is that the early network could be maintained from, you could be a validator with a laptop, right? That is not possible anymore. Like, the hash power involved in Bitcoin is crazy. Like, you need entire hash farms, you need entire institutions. These are heavily regulated companies, and they are the ones that determine and vote on how things are upgraded, or if things are not upgraded, as we're often seeing with Bitcoin. So yeah, I think it is interesting to see how the community has changed, and it's kind of necessitated that. But like you say, a big point there is it has stagnated. Things haven't changed, and that might be part of the angle. Gold doesn't change, so you don't really want digital gold necessarily to change. But in 2008, the demands of the network were very light touch, right? There was no demand for transactions, there was no demand for throughput. But now we're in a very different scenario where blocks are constantly being filled. Maybe there is demand and a need to expand, but they decided not to because digital gold does not need that.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a really important point that I want to make sure we expand out here, is that Bitcoin is not being institutionalized now for the first time. I would very much argue that it's been institutionalized for a very, very long time, the two main sets of institutions being the miners or nodes, and then crypto exchanges as well, right? So these are two classes of companies, businesses that have sprung up over the last decade. As early as I'm sure 2015, 16, you had the first kind of fully legitimate corporate entities that were doing these massive mining operations that you're talking about, right? So for a long time, the number of actual block producers on Bitcoin has been very small in any given time, right? There's only a handful of say like 8 to 12 or something that are actually producing the blocks in any kind of short given time period. So in a way, those are the institutions that have institutionalized Bitcoin for a very, very long time. The crypto exchanges are kind of the other side of that, where they were not so much about institutions at the network level and maintaining the blockchain, but then they were the ones providing the bridge for people to, actually buy, hold, sell, transfer these assets, right? So your wallets to a lesser extent, because a lot of those have been open source, but then the exchanges, which have kind of become the de facto wallets for most people, right? Like a lot of people just custody their assets, like Bitcoin now with the exchanges. So these have been around for a very, very long time. The dream of a kind of highly, highly decentralized Bitcoin, I think, has not been around for a long time in practicality. And then what we're talking about now in 2024, 25 is this next wave of institutions and how they institutionalize, say, access to Bitcoin or the Bitcoin supply and things like
Mm.
that. So kind of almost like second order institutionalization. I don't know if that makes sense, Alec, but I'm just
No,
kind of
it
spitballing. That's what I'm
it
thinking.
it it does make sense. Well, like I think when I think about like the institutionalization of Bitcoin, for me, it's about the ability for you can think about it from the network capacity. Like, okay, are validators and network administrators for Bitcoin distributed and decentralized enough that if, say, 8 of them go down or most of them go down, the network can still run? If a bomb goes off in a certain location like the US, can Bitcoin still carry on technically? And then the other side is the power dynamics. Like, so right now, when I think of the problems of institutionalization of Bitcoin, it's the pressure that big institutions, say single entities like a BlackRock, for example, or a US government could apply to Bitcoin network more generally, all the validators involved to actually make changes that don't necessarily suit the network, but suit the higher up
Mhm.
institutions themselves. That's kind of, I think, that the two angles. But what you said there makes a lot of sense to me. I realize we've been talking for 17 minutes and we actually haven't touched on like the pros and cons. And I think it's probably time that we jumped into it. Should we start with the pros? Because there definitely are a lot of pros to this. Obviously, the big one is number go up, right? A lot of people that invested early on and are in Bitcoin specifically, it's mostly an investment piece for returns rather than using Bitcoin for daily life. I would say that quite generally. Maybe I'm speaking a bit too broadly there. Another one I think, which is a bit more important, is, and I know you love this, Jack, is regulation, regulatory clarity. Like, this is demanded by institutions, investors. Like, the idea of, say, the validators, the miners, the people involved in the network, kind of operating to a higher standard, like not being nefarious, being operating with clean money, potentially, maybe being transparent with their business operations. Like Coinbase is a great example of an exchange where they have to say prove their liquidity, prove that the people they're hiring are operating the right way, they're not doing anything nefarious. I think that's obviously a great thing to bring to Bitcoin and crypto as a whole, is these big organizations that are accountable and are accountable to a higher standard by, say, governments, institutions, and retail users.
Yeah, I 100%. I think for me, it comes back to, in the lifetime of Bitcoin, it could have failed and died at a number of different periods and points in time, right? It could have failed as a project many, many times over the last 17 years. Um, and part of that process of, it still being a living, breathing thing right now is to convince the institutions that it should be taken seriously. It could, in theory, have been regulated out of existence. I'm glad it hasn't been, because I think, that would have been potentially an overstep. And especially given you're seeing how much value lots of the institutions now see in Bitcoin, I think this was the right move. But it's important to acknowledge that could have happened. Um, and kind of the broader point for me is I don't think Bitcoin could ever have existed if it wasn't willing. Well, it couldn't have existed in 2025 if it wasn't willing to play ball with the existing world, essentially, right? If it was going to be this complete, separate entity that tried to run itself by its own rules, to an extent, in the technology way, it kind of does that. And you're seeing now institutions try and almost mimic some of the ways that Bitcoin works in things that they're now doing in establishing, private networks and things like that, or even kind of permissioned consortia of these blockchain adjacent networks and structures. But yeah, my point being, I don't think that there was ever a scenario where Bitcoin would be here in 2025, let alone 2050, if it wasn't going to be, you know, playing alongside existing infrastructure. And nor should it ever have tried. I think because that's part of the core, that value proposition that we talked about of Bitcoin originally. A huge part of that is the word permissionless, right? It means there
Mm.
are there are no there are no there are no restrictions on who can participate, and that's one of the bedrocks of Bitcoin, in my opinion, maybe one of the biggest for the whole value proposition. And that obviously then includes institutions. You can't then say
Mm.
exclude a set of people, whether they're corporate or individuals, from participating. So I think they're always going to be involved in some way, and I'm quite glad that they now are, basically.
Today's episode is sponsored by the VChain Foundation.
Now, we often talk about how emerging technologies like blockchain have the potential to revolutionize sustainability, and VeChain is at the forefront of this green movement with initiatives like VBetterDAO. Let's take a closer look.
Imagine tracking small actions, like recycling, at low cost, making them valuable assets. These verified records build a massive collective impact, benefiting people through their own actions. Sound a bit complex, but VeChain made it fun. Explore our apps at vbetter.com.
VeChain's goal is to power a new era of sustainable solutions. So if you've got an app idea or just want to earn rewards for small, sustainable actions every day, go check out vbetterdao.com to find out more. And now, back to the show. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I think this is always inevitable. Like as soon
Mhm.
as a traditional finance company took note of, say, Bitcoin, they were always going to invest very heavily in, because traditional finance has all the money, or they would have had all the money at the time, then they can invest heavily and take over the network, as we're seeing in a lot of ways, like not take over in a bad way, but like start to influence and maybe take ownership of a lot of large parts of the network. I think on the regulation point as well, like there are good, like a lot of people are kind of anti-regulation. I think there are good points to that as well. Like a lot of crypto is obviously not like maybe more than traditional finance, but it's more detectable and definitely more in the media, is used for illicit funds, can be used for, terrorism and all these types of things. So it's quite good that we are seeing, say, networks crack down. Like a good example is Tether. Tether's frozen 2.9 billion in illicit funds, cooperating with like over 275 law enforcement agencies.
Yeah, we've obviously had like loads of examples from years and years ago at this point. I remember there being a case in around 2019-20 where you get these big cross-jurisdictional task forces that work together to and have closed down crime rings doing really heinous crimes, the kind of thing you can't really even say on YouTube without having to bleep it out, so I won't bother. But really terrible crimes, these rings doing them, and they making the false assumption that they could use Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to fund that and skirt around it, and essentially that's a really good case where the institutions, both the kind of traditional ones, the kind of lawmakers and regulators and in law enforcers, have worked together with the kind of new breed of crypto specific institutions like your exchanges, because those are the kind of choke points you can use to stop the flow of funds, right? Especially when you have things like stable coins, as well as you mentioned Tether. I think it's a really good thing, because again, you in order to play ball with the existing world and to not be regulated out of existence, you need to make sure that people are cooperating to stop crime ultimately, or at least to make it the best effort to stop crime. There's no way you're going to stop all crime, crypto or otherwise, right? And again, on the regulation point, I think that's very important, all that kind of side of things you mentioned. But crypto has been such a wild west for so long now, and it's just kind of, for me, that phase is just starting to end, or at least I thought it was, until
Mm.
certain kind of recent events around certain meme tokens and things like that. But there's been numerous cases, right, where things have collapsed, end users have lost out. There's been plenty of scams going on in the space, and I think the regulation catching up now and helping provide legitimate protections for users that are pretty much getting to on par with the existing financial world is only a good thing, really.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially when you think about, say, some of the new characteristics that are brought up with blockchain technology and Bitcoin specifically is like the immutability. Once something happens, it's very, very difficult to then make it unhappen. You send a transaction from party A to B. If that's the wrong person, there's no real recourse for B to send that money back. But when we start to bring institutions, maybe some people will be opposed to the idea of KYC and maybe a Coinbase KYCing their users. But if I all of a sudden know who B is and I can prove that that transaction should have happened, Coinbase can apply pressure to say B to send that money back to A, and that is only a good thing in most cases, like 99% of cases. I think another big strong reason for having this institutional adoption is use cases, like enterprise use cases and onboarding. Like there are so many use cases that are enabled through institutional adoption of crypto and Bitcoin. Like most enterprises, if we think of them as institutions, wouldn't touch this stuff unless there was clear regulatory involvement. If there wasn't like BlackRock's and MicroStrategy all pushing into this space, like you think of one of the most like widely used example of blockchain for a given use case is supply chain, right? Supply chain. That involves many countries, cross jurisdiction, from farmers in the field to institutions and enterprises with 100,000 plus people. That is not possible when you have this kind of like edge case Bitcoin being passed from person to person. You need big institution enterprises, hardware across every aspect of that supply chain for it to work. And there are so many different use cases that blockchain can be applied to, whether that is crypto specifically, but also digital identity. We're talking about AI a lot, healthcare. Like blockchain is so much bigger than just Bitcoin. And without institutional adoption of these things, there's so many use cases that would never have been even talked about or discussed, but we are starting to see them be addressed with blockchain. It's still very early doors. They're not widely spread right now, but in the next 5 to 10 years, because of this regulatory clarity, because of institutions moving into the space, I'm hoping we'll see use cases outside of finance that can be solved using blockchain technology.
Yeah, I think that's really important because, when you said use cases, I was getting ready for you to load into the almost the financial sector use cases, which maybe we can cover after. But you're 100% right. Like when we talk about Bitcoin, we should not limit ourselves to just the financial instrument side. You can use Bitcoin in so many interesting ways as a settlement layer for data, essentially, right? As you were describing with that supply chain, IoT, there are hundred of use cases. One of my favorite ones, or examples of where this point is being proven, is when I think some researchers from Microsoft were looking at how do we build a really good digital identity system. I think it was called the Side Tree Protocol. They originally went for and eventually became a W3C approved standard or vetted standard. They were using Bitcoin as a settlement layer for your digital identifiers there, your DIDs. So it was a natural choice for them. I think the proof of work aspect of Bitcoin was also playing a role there, right? And that's something you shouldn't forget, I think, is that the fact that Bitcoin still uses proof of work makes it arguably the gold standard for data settlement, right? Because it's so much harder to rewrite records. But that's not to say anything of the myriad financial specific use cases that a lot of the institutions we're talking about are now themselves talking about. So, improving on remittances, for example, payment versus delivery, just cutting, minor pain points out of the existing financial services world. There are so many sources of inefficiency, not least the fact that these things don't operate 24/7, whereas Bitcoin is offering a new method to do things in a 24/7 365 fashion. So I think that's some of the stuff that I've seen a lot of the institutions actually talking about, which to me is financial innovation that wouldn't have happened without Bitcoin as well.
I think even on that point, you can't decouple even like the data aspect of Bitcoin or whatever crypto you're using from the financial aspect as well. It's the very fact that we have these kind of financial incentives built into Bitcoin for miners, validators to maintain the network that makes it such a great way to store data and to have these DIDs that, otherwise could be lost. Like what's the incentive if a country goes down to store that DID? There is no. But if a validator goes down, there's 10 other validators that are willing to jump into that network to maintain the entire history, maintain that DID, because there's a financial incentive that eventually a transaction might be generated and they'll get a fee as a result of that. So yeah, there's a lot of good pros for Bitcoin. I think one of the obvious ones, like you said, is institutional Bitcoin means all-time highs, number goes up. It also, I think, like another side of that is less volatility. Like this is one of the reasons why a lot of institutions, enterprises haven't gone into Bitcoin, is because historically it has been so volatile, and that has been, on the one side because there's very little liquidity, so big moves, small moves, sorry, make big influences on the entire market. But it's also the type of users, like retail users, maybe a bit more short-sighted, looking for snipes, short-term gains, all this kind of stuff. But institutional investors think much longer term. So it's the 5 to 10 year play. They're not going to pull out just because someone said, oh, Bitcoin's going to go to zero tomorrow. They tend to have big research teams. They make decisions quite lethargically, but they are long-term decisions. So again, institutional adoption, less volatility, probably means more institutional adoption.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is worth pointing out that I often forget is, in terms of market cap, I've just double checked now, but Bitcoin is currently sitting 6th in terms of all assets on Earth by market cap, right? So only above it are Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, and gold. And gold is kind of way out in front. But now Bitcoin's bigger as an asset class than both Alphabet, the company, and silver, right? So these are huge, entities, commodities, and the volatility of Bitcoin now looks much more like a big stock or share than what it used to, like a small cap investment years and years ago, which could go crazy. Like Bitcoin is still moving plenty, but it's much more in line with the kind of volatility you would normally expect to see in the financial markets. And yeah, that's purely as a result, I'm sure, of the market cap growth it's had in the last few years and the stability you're talking about.
FYI, Jack's got one of those graphs that you see all the investors have open with like 20 screens. Number goes up, arrows everywhere.
Okay. My technical analysis every day.
We've talked about a lot of the positives. Let's go into some of the negatives, because there are some, and I think it's not just the cypherpunks, cypherpunks that are talking about this. I do agree with a lot of this stuff. One of the obvious ones is the centralization of supply and control. Like we said, around 10% of the current Bitcoin supply is now held by big institutions. And what does that mean? Like it obviously means like influence in a lot of ways. Like if you have, say, a government with a large, it's like the same with companies, right? When someone owns like a large share of a company, they have an influence in that company's direction. I think of it in a lot of ways in the same as Bitcoin. If you have, at the end of the day, it's the validators who determine what happens on the network, what the upgrades are, but they are beholden to the users and the holders of Bitcoin. Like they don't want to see people pull out of their network and go to a competitor, which is like it's a real possibility in a lot of ways. So if, say, someone owns 10% of the entire network and they say jump, like these validators may not jump, but they're going to take note of what the command is, right? And I think that influence isn't necessarily a good thing. Like I would prefer if the influence was held by many different parties, probably, than a few individuals. It's like, what's the phrase? It's like a good dictator will do more than democracy, but a bad dictator will ruin everything. So it's like you don't have these corrective mechanisms when you only have a few centralized controlling parties, which is a bit of a concern.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because I think I have a slightly differing view, but not completely. I don't I don't have an innate problem with centralization of cryptocurrencies holding in particular, because I think this is just a function of capitalism. Every asset class is pretty heavily centralized. It's not necessarily worse in that way. And actually, what you mentioned there about the separation between miners and holders of the asset is something that Bitcoin has over potentially other asset classes, traditional assets. Which does mean the power to make decisions can reside a bit further away from those people who hold them, right? Maybe not true of all cryptocurrencies. So I think that's a really good thing in favor of Bitcoin. But crucially, I think Bitcoin is in a unique position amongst the whole set of crypto assets on this point, because I agree with you. For 99% of assets, it's a big problem who controls most of the supply, because especially when you talk about institutions, they can effectively become the kingmakers, I think, of what gets adopted, what become the household names or the major kind of adopted assets. I think Bitcoin has such a specific, unique story and has set its stall out so uniquely as the OG digital gold now. And that narrative is so strong amongst the public, not just the institutions, that I think there will be no kingmaker of whether or not Bitcoin succeeds. I think it's already reached that threshold of kind of snowballing. But I agree, for other asset classes or other cryptocurrencies, then which institutions choose to use it, adopt it, custody it, that's going to have a huge and probably outsized impact on which ones survive, which may also be a good thing, because you want the good ones to survive.
Yeah,
You want the
you want
ones that the risk
competition.
and compliance team, yeah, you want competition, and you want the best of the best to survive for whatever criteria that is. But yeah, I understand the concern as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this separation of validators and, say, asset owners. Is that unique? Like, if I think of someone that owns gold, do they influence how gold is mined? Probably not. Maybe they do indirectly. I think that, is there something unique about, say, the BlackRocks of the world and their control over, say, what should happen on the network? Like, is there an influence there where BlackRock, which doesn't necessarily have much of a clue about how Bitcoin works, and there's no guarantee they have technical understanding of the impacts of, say, a network upgrade? Should they have that influence there? And I'm unsure how I feel about it. For some reason, it feels weird, but you are right that is just all systems, that capitalism kind of tends towards centralization. I guess, like, maybe the promise of Bitcoin and Web3 was that would be stopped. Like, there wouldn't be that it would empower individuals and reduce the likelihood of centralization. But maybe
Yeah.
that's just always going to happen.
Well, yeah, and I also think so. Yeah, this is a very nuanced point, and I think there are ways to argue both ways on it. I definitely concede that. I'm just thinking in terms of the worry being, I think the worry would be, okay, how much decision making power will the asset holders have in how the system changes and operates in the future? And I don't have a huge worry that the financial institutions will want to change Bitcoin too much, because
Mm.
it does what it says on the tin from the perspective of most institutions. It works as a good asset class. There's high demand for it. You can do interesting things with it. And I don't think an asset that is in the top 5 or 6 now of market cap, you expect to change on like a fundamental level. So I don't think there's going to be too much positioning for that. But yeah, it's still an interesting question. Like, maybe something big did need to change in the future, then
Mm.
how do those holders get involved, especially if they're not currently contributing to anything to do with the infrastructure of the network or the mining? Like, how do they become, go from 0 to 1 to make those decisions in the future? Like, that would be interesting to see.
I guess, like, yeah, to be like, give a more specific example, we look at Tether, and Tether's obviously in like this Web 2.5 solution. It's run by a very centralized private entity, so they are very different in that sense. But we talked about, say, some of the illicit funds that have been frozen. Like, this is happening more and more as they become, say, more institutionalized and regulated. Could you imagine a world in which, say, I don't know, a government pressures Bitcoin miners, say they have 65% of the total hash power in their country, and as we said, these hash farms are becoming more and more regulated because they are huge enterprises now with a large investment that can't just move around the world, say, similar to Ethereum and proof of stake networks? Could you imagine a world in which a government puts pressure on those miners, those validators, to, say, not allow certain transactions?
Yeah, I think I can. And I think that one of my, this is a very, very difficult question to answer. I think it's one of the big
Here's a
outstanding
political
questions
answer.
for Bitcoin. Yeah, no, I think it
It's
is
a
one of
great
the hardest
question. Give me
one of
10
the
minutes to
hardest
think about the
things.
answer.
Yeah, well, I wish I had some notes. It is one of the hardest questions to solve, because yeah, you're right. As soon as you allow things like freezing at the protocol base level of Bitcoin, then you know, you have a jurisdictional problem because Bitcoin is global. How do you enforce that on some and not others? And how do you also enforce that without kind of causing your nodes in your own country, for example, to become non-competitive, or cease to be used essentially? Um, my gut feeling is that the threshold for protocol level things will be incredibly high, and that forfeiture and seizure and that kind of thing, freezing of assets at like the Bitcoin level, we've already got a lot of evidence of it happening. So much has been seized in criminal cases. I don't know the exact numbers. I'm pretty sure it's in the tens, if not hundreds of millions at this point. UK actually, I think, is leading in the stats. People think that the US government holds the most, but I believe it's the UK has seized the most. I think I saw someone speaking about that recently. But yeah, so I think a lot of it can be done at a second order, second layer thing,
Mm.
and I don't necessarily think there'll be huge appetite to enforce that at the base layer in the future. But if it
That
ever
makes
needed to
sense.
be, yeah, it's hard.
I think on that kind of the second layer, like, another thing we're seeing with this kind of I guess is another rise is custodial dominance, is that 80% of new crypto users in 2025 are coming into the space via custodial services, your Coinbases, your PayPals, your Robinhoods, mainly because like they know how to interact with users. They've got all the money, they've got all of the user base already, and they're just offering these additional services to their user base that's very keen. They've got the super streamlined UX, all of that abstraction of managing private keys that most people don't want to touch. And self-custody is declining, making I guess the system a bit more vulnerable to those off-chain controls you talked about, the freezes and the seizures. And on the one hand, you could say, well, that was an early promise of this technology, was the fact that we didn't need to rely on central entities, and we did have like cash as we do now. That was one of the, I guess, the main promises of this. But like I said, the other side of that, the flip side of that, is that means that if there is someone doing criminal activity and you can prove it, then a second layer company can get involved, freeze your assets, and you do go to jail, and that money is returned. And that is obviously a good thing. And I'm very glad that a lot of custodians are doing that.
Yeah, and I agree. It is a difficult choice to be made between whether you're going to custody them with an institution or not. I think again, crucially for me, there's nothing being enforced either way, and I don't think ever it will be enforced either way. Maybe that's a place where the centralization of the asset could cause an issue, because if all the asset is residing in the hands of very few, then how do you get onboarded to self custody to start with? Well, you have to go and get it from one of those. But most of the big exchanges will still let you offboard and self custody if you want. Like Coinbase are pretty good at letting you self custody. Obviously, you're taking on more risk as an individual, but that's always going to be there. I think is how much you're willing to. Where's the bigger risk for you? Is it institutional risk or is it individual personal security risk? But yeah, I don't think there'll ever be one of those options available. I think it'll always be both, the way things are going. And to me, I a lot of for me the biggest issue, and I say issue, very very cautiously, but my only kind of downside that I really care about with the institutionalization of crypto generally is that it signals a little bit of a death of the old guard of Bitcoin and crypto. I think ultimately, Bitcoin may have been even more valuable as a digital gold that, also functioned as a payment system, but I don't think it's ever going to recover to be that now. And all the payment side of things will probably be subsumed by second layers. And it'd be great. It's great that we will have the payment side attached to Bitcoin, but I think it would have been strictly better if it could have all been done at the base layer. And I think what we're seeing in the last couple of years signifies the death of that dream. But maybe it was always too much to dream of. And, I'm just wishful thinking there.
Yeah, I think that you are right in that, because we now have this narrative of safe digital gold that institutions clearly favor. That is what's going to happen. Like, it's kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy. But the innovation won't happen on Bitcoin. We're seeing the innovation happen elsewhere. And although all the market cap is going towards Bitcoin, actually, I think Ethereum versus Bitcoin is actually the highest it's ever been in like the last couple of weeks, which is great to hear, because there's a lot more innovation happening on those kind of like altcoins and Ethereum versus Bitcoin. It is sad in a lot of ways. And like I say, I think I've read a lot of things about the early innovators of Bitcoin either completely leaving the Web3 space because they felt disenfranchised and the vision's gone. Obviously, they've made a huge amount of money, so they don't need to work anymore, or move into these completely separated projects and trying to innovate there because they don't have that big institutional pressure to not touch something that ain't broken. I think overall, I maybe haven't seen it, but I am very pro institutional adoption of Bitcoin. I think they are a player. I think they're accelerating the retail users and general usage of this because they've got the money, because people trust the brands. My mom isn't going to touch Bitcoin anytime soon, but if her bank says, this is a great investment, we'll do it on your behalf, then she's much more likely to go into that space and not get all the characteristics like the complete self-custodial aspects, but get some of the characteristics like the fact that, as an asset, it is going to accrue value because there's only a limited supply. Like, she isn't going to be absolutely ruined by constant printing of fiat and all these kind of hyperinflation things we see with the traditional financial system. And also a big thing is custodians do protect users in a way that self-custodial wallets do not. And this happened to me recently. I know, Jack, this, but I'll talk a little bit about it hopefully in next week's episode, when things can go really wrong and people can lose assets and you do feel completely powerless. And these custodians, because of regulation or because of their kind of sympathy for users or whatever it is, they really do add a lot of value for users, protecting them, helping them, supporting them, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about it next week. But overall, I think it is a good thing institutions move into this space. But I want retail to also exist and it not to be like 99.9% is owned by institutions and the 0.1 is owned by, normal people like you and me.
Yeah, and I also think just my position. I think it's pretty clear. I'm very pro institutional adoption. Um, I think there will be an equilibrium reached anyway between how much of this is fully institutionalized and how much of it is retail focused, self custody, etc. Because the value proposition of Bitcoin is strictly less if you go too far one way or the other. I think I've always thought of Bitcoin as it's a credible, viable alternative to traditional money, traditional assets now. Yeah, I hope we do see improvements in the use of Bitcoin for payments. How they do that, I'm not sure. But ultimately, if you're willing to sacrifice enough of your wealth in fees at the end of the day, if you're desperate to use Bitcoin, it probably will always be usable to in some degree. So like, you will always have the option to transact on chain if you're willing to pay enough or wait long enough. It's just obviously not going to be practical for the kind of things we hoped it might be. But yeah, that's where the innovation's happening elsewhere. And I think it'd be interesting to see how many of those other chains where we are seeing that kind of the micropayment style innovation used for small transactions, the actual money of the internet day to day. It'd be interesting to see if we get 2 or 3 of them survive and work in the future. That will also be because of institutional backing, I think, if they do survive. So yeah, it'd be interesting to just see if we do get any, and if so, which they are.
So the dream isn't dead, but maybe it's just happening elsewhere other than BTC. Yeah, I guess thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed our little episode on institutional adoption and what it means for Web3. And join us next time to untangle a little more of Web3.